Okay, so in this video, we are going to discuss some of the important physical milestones that occur in kind of the first quarter of life, starting with newborns. So, although it may seem like newborn babies just eat, sleep, and cry, from the moment they are born, they actually already have a set of responses that allow them to interact and survive in the world. And these are called reflexes. So newborn reflexes are inborn automatic responses to particular forms of stimulation that helps them to survive. Um, we're going to go through the main ones here, starting with the rooting reflex, which is what you see here. So this is when a baby will turn its head towards anything that touches its cheek, pretty much. And this is because it helps them to obtain nourishment by orienting its head either towards a breast or a bottle. It will turn its head towards anything because this is a reflex. It's not choosing to do this. So you put anything up against their cheek and they will engage in this reflex and turn their head towards it. And then similarly, you have the sucking reflex, which is here. So this is where they will suck on objects placed in their mouth. You can put anything you put in their mouth, they will suck on. And again, this is enabling them to obtain nourishment. Here we have the grasping reflex. So if you put anything into the palm of their hands, they will cling onto it for dear life. And it's actually strong enough that you can literally lift a baby by its hands. And in terms of survival, I'll come to that once we've discussed these two because they're somewhat linked. Here we have the Moro reflex. You can't really tell in this picture, but you have this video, which I've also put into the lecture notes. It's literally about 2 minutes and it will demonstrate what these look like. So I strongly recommend watching that. Plus it's really cute. But the Moro reflex is where the baby will spread its arms and then suddenly pull them back in when they're when they're startled. So if there's a loud noise or they feel like they're falling, their arms suddenly go out and they come back in really quickly. We then have here, we have the Babinski reflex. So if you stroke the sole of a newborn's foot, their toes will curl outward. Now, in general, these two specifically, but also this one, meaning the grasping reflex, as much as they might not seem to have an adaptive function now, as in maybe they don't seem to help us survive now, it's likely a remnant of our evolutionary heritage, where babies did have to cling on to prevent themselves from falling while they were being carried around. So obviously that grasping reflex would be important. That Moro reflex, if they start to fall, their arms go out and they suddenly bring them back in, which would help them grab onto something. And obviously being able to curl their toes that way would give extra grip. The reality is why newborns have those reflexes, we can't be sure, but theoretically that's what is thought. Now, these usually will disappear within the first 6 months, and in fact, you expect them to. If they do not disappear, then that might be a sign of delayed development in some way, because these are meant to just be for the first 6 months of life while they are developing the skills they need in order to help them survive, and then they disappear. Okay. So when babies are born, their sensory abilities are actually not yet fully developed. And in particular, the one that I want you to know on the exam is vision, because that is the least developed sense. When a baby is born, their vision is actually very blurry. Despite that, they do show, if you present a newborn with face-like patterns and non-face-like patterns, they will show a preference for face-like patterns like this. This would be considered a face-like pattern. When it comes to hearing, that is better developed, but still not fully. They can hear a lot of different sounds, but what you see is that they show a preference for human voices, specifically their mothers over a stranger's. And actually researchers looked into that before they're even born, and they found that even fetuses will respond more strongly to their mother's voice than the voice of another female stranger's. And when I say they respond more strongly, in terms of their elevated heart rates. So that's how they measured that. The last couple of senses that I want to mention, smell and taste. So by around 5 to 6 days of age, they can distinguish between the smell of their mother and others. And they'll start showing a preference for different smells and tastes in general. So for example, they will suck on something sweet for longer. They'll frown at things that smell bad, like rotten eggs, and they'll smile at things that smell sweet. For example, chocolate. And again, this most likely comes back to evolution and survival. We need to know when we're eating or when we're potentially going to eat something that might be bad and might make us sick versus something that's going to be okay to eat. And that really comes down to smell, which we've discussed before. That is what tells us whether something might be okay to eat or not. Oh, sorry, went to the wrong one. Okay, so when it comes to, physical development in the first few years of life or throughout childhood, I just want to focus on the changes that are happening in the brain, and then I'll briefly mention motor development. So when it comes to the brain, babies are born with about 100 billion neurons, which is about the same amount as an adult. Obviously, their brain is much smaller, although interesting fact that around age 6, their brain is about 90% of its adult size. So it's almost its full size by age 6. But anyway, I'm going off topic. The point being that they have about the same amount of neurons as an adult. Now, what happens is throughout infancy and childhood, the nervous system goes through something called a blooming period. So this is where, as the child is experiencing the world and they're learning new things, their neurons form thousands of new synapses, or thousands of new connections between neurons. Okay. However, it will sometimes make connections that are not needed, and so we also go through something called a pruning period during childhood, and this continues somewhat into adolescence, where any unused connections are eliminated. Okay, so the neural connections are reduced, and that is to allow the brain to function more efficiently, right? If you've got all of these different connections and some of them aren't needed, things are gonna be a little bit slower. So the idea is that anything that isn't used gets lost. So the saying is neurons that fire together wire together. So the skills that you're using, it will stay. Okay, the connections for those skills will stay, and they'll actually become stronger. They will wire together more strongly because you're using it. But if you're not using it, then you lose those connections. And actually, while we're on this topic, if you remember back to the chapter on sensation and perception, you watched a video on synesthesia, which is where you have this overlapping of the senses. So, for example, a word might cause you to taste something, or music might have colors. So you see this crossing of senses. And the theory proposed in that video is that it might be the result of connections that should have been eliminated not being eliminated. So basically, during this pruning period, certain connections that aren't needed are kept, and that could explain why in some people you see this crossing of senses. They were connections that occurred and then were never lost. But that's a theory. So moving on to motor development, I just want to discuss what we mean by this. So this is looking at the development of motor skills, or the ability to move our bodies and manipulate objects. So this actually occurs in a fairly orderly sequence. And what I mean by that is the skills will start off easy and gradually become more advanced. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you've got simple things here, like just being able to lift your chin up and then your chest up, and gradually you progress and your motor skills become more advanced. Now there are two types: fine motor skills and gross motor skills. Gross motor skills are those involving our larger muscle groups in our arms and our legs and all of our larger movements. So this includes things like balancing, running, walking. I actually, when I do clinical interviews for research, I ask questions about motor skills, and actually I can share a couple of these with you. So some of the questions for gross motor skills involve things like can kick a ball while standing, can safely climb on and off low objects, can stand unsupported for at least a minute, can jump off the ground with both feet without falling. So these bigger movements. Fine motor skills then involve all of those smaller muscle groups in our fingers, our toes, also in our eyes, and the coordination of small actions. So, for example, gripping a pencil. Any movements that require more control from the brain. If you remember back when we looked at the motor cortex, parts of the body that are involved in our fine motor skills, so our fingers and actually our mouth and our tongue, they have much more of the brain or much more of the motor cortex dedicated to them because they require much more control. So to give you some examples of questions for fine motor skills, we have things like can stack at least 4 small blocks or other small objects upright, can unwrap small objects like candy, can turn book or magazine pages one by one, can open doors by turning a doorknob at a handle. So these are some examples of fine motor skills. Okay, so moving on to physical development in adolescence. So this is referring to that transition period between late childhood and early adulthood. Now, one of the reasons I want to discuss this particular time point, and this is the last time point we're going to look at in regards to physical development, is because being a teenager comes with a lot of developmental changes, especially physical, and it can be a very challenging and confusing time for some reasons that we are going to look at connected to physical development. So obviously, along with entering adolescence comes puberty, which is basically the period during which our bodies become sexually mature. So you see 2 things happen during this time. First of all, our primary sex characteristics mature. So these are all of our reproductive organs, anything involved in the ability to reproduce. Okay. Second, our secondary sex characteristics start to develop. So these are all of the physical features that separate males and females, but they're not specifically associated with reproduction. So this includes things like growing hair in certain places, starting to sweat, women growing breasts. These would all be secondary sex characteristics. Now, obviously, not everyone goes through puberty at the same time. It can depend a lot on, of course, genetics, but also things like diet, exercise, exposure to chemicals. So all of these things can influence when someone goes through puberty. What's interesting is it seems to be starting to happen earlier than in previous generations. I don't know enough about the research on that, but I can say that they've noticed that beginning to happen. Now, the reason we're talking about this is because the timing of puberty can have big consequences and ultimately affect our experience of being a teenager. So, for example, boys that mature earlier tend to, of course, be bigger and stronger throughout adolescence, and that can give them, number one, an advantage in sports, but it can also contribute to a more positive self-image because that is something that is looked at more positively when it comes to men. Being bigger and stronger and musclier is associated with masculinity. Doesn't mean it should be, but it is quite often. So you may see that higher self-image, more positive self-image in boys that mature earlier. On the other hand, boys that mature later may be more likely to get bullied. They may have obviously a disadvantage when it comes to sports, so they might start feeling a little bit left out, and that could affect their self-esteem. You actually see the opposite with girls. So girls that mature earlier, tend to have lower self-esteem. They tend to have a more negative body image. You see more symptoms of anxiety and depression. You'll see sexual behavior earlier, not always, but you may. You see more substance abuse problems. Now, again, just because research shows that there's an association with these things doesn't mean you're necessarily going to see it in a girl that matures early, but you're more likely to than in a girl that matures later. Now, that has a lot to do with how people react to a girl's physical maturation. In the same way that I mentioned, we associate being strong and muscly with being masculine. There are certain stereotypes that we hold, and so people tend to respond in a certain way to girls that mature earlier, and that seems to be explaining some of these difficulties that you see. And the main thing that I want to focus on and what I want you to take away from this slide is the development of the frontal lobe, or the fact that it is not fully developed during adolescence. So your frontal lobe actually continues to develop into your early 20s and is thought to finish developing around 25. Now, what that means is during adolescence, it's not fully developed. Okay. Now remember that the frontal lobe is kind of like our control panel, and it's involved in things like problem solving, decision making, but it's also involved in things like judgment, impulse control, planning. Okay, so that could explain why in teenagers you tend to see they're not great at making judgments. You see increased risk-taking behaviors. You see a harder time planning, and you tend to hear like, oh, it's the end of the world, or they act like little things are the end of the world because they just don't have the ability yet to really look forward into the future and to plan ahead and to see how things might change. So a lot of these stereotypes, and we are going to look at more when we get to cognition, but a lot of these stereotypes connected to being a teenager can really be explained by the fact that the frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. So it's not really their fault. But yes, as the frontal lobe continues to develop, that's when we start having that ability to make better judgments, to plan ahead more, to control our impulses. And that becomes easier once you can plan ahead, because you can predict that there are going to be consequences and you can act accordingly.